Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Shear, and you are currently looking at a picture of the Columbia River, which is a geological feature of Washington we've talked about a lot, but features heavily in today's topic, which is Robert Gray's expedition to the Pacific Northwest. And yeah, I'm on Edpuzzle now, which is kind of cool because you're both watching your video lesson and completing your video assignment today, so 2 birds, 1 stone. All right, if you remember, we've talked about 2 of these 6 early notable expeditions to Washington, the Pacific Northwest. We talked about Juan de Fuca, we talked about James Cook. We're now moving on to our 3rd one, Mr. Robert Gray, who, as you might note, is the first American to come to the Pacific Northwest, and he discovered the Columbia River in 1790. He actually made 2 trips out here. So this will feature heavily in today's lesson, but there are 3 major impacts that come out of the Gray expedition. The first being Robert Gray's discovery of the Columbia River. And I just want to note, when we say discovery, that means from a European or American point of view, the Chinook Indians lived on the Columbia River. Many Indians, the Clatsop Indians lived on the Columbia River. Many Native Americans were very aware that the river existed. But as far as Europe and America and as far as the Caucasian world went, Robert Gray discovered the Columbia River in 1790. He also helped usher in an animal fur trade era in Washington, specifically beaver and otter pelts. And lastly, he's the first American to come to Washington. So we'll talk a bit about him, but he's not a British sailor. He's born in the United States. United States, of course, became a country in 1776. So when he comes out here, he is sailing under a U.S. flag. So just a quick background about Robert Gray. He was born about 1755 in Rhode Island, and there's very little known about his childhood, very little known about actually his later years as well. They're pretty confident he died in 1806, probably of a disease he contracted on a boat, or came into contact with on a boat. But very little is known about his personal life, except for a few of his big voyages. So he came to the Pacific Northwest first in 1776. He actually passed James Cook's boat. In 1787, he became the first American to sail the entire globe. He circumnavigated the globe, which was a great point of pride for the U.S. And in 1790, on his 2nd voyage to Washington, he discovered the Columbia River. And again, if you're not getting the point, it's really important that he's representing America, because that comes up later and it helps us make a claim to this region in general. So I just want to do a quick reminder. We talked about this extensively at James Cook, but there is a mythical Northwest Passage that Europeans and the United States are obsessed with finding. If there is a water route through North America, through South America, or through Central America, it keeps sailors from having to sail all the way around Cape Horn to the south or all the way through the Arctic Ocean to the north. And again, they do not have complete maps in the 1700s, and the continent really is just starting to take shape from a map perspective. And just to remind you, the Columbia River makes up our southern border, so what he discovered was this right here, that mouth, right by Longview and Astoria, Oregon. So the first big impact, Gray discovers and sails up the Columbia River. Now, it might not seem like a big deal that he sailed up the Columbia River, but it is. Here's the mouth of the Columbia. And if you don't know, this is Astoria, Oregon here. But this is a really treacherous place to sail, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I wanted to give you a little context. Many of you guys will go to Astoria, and this line This is the Washington side over here by Long Beach. On the south, you got Astoria, and this is Oregon. This line is a giant bridge that I know some of you guys have been on that connects our states. And Astoria is beautiful. So this is Astoria now. And the reason I point this out is because you might go here, and when you do someday, very good chance you guys will vacation here or travel down here, especially if you go to the Oregon coast. I hope that you can take into consideration that this is what Robert Gray found. And Astoria, of course, is you might have seen it in the Goonies movies. It used to be a big filming location. Other movies filmed there include Kindergarten Cop, and I know many of you guys have seen Free Willy, also filmed in Astoria, Oregon. And it really is just a very, very kind of quintessential seaside town. So as I mentioned, part of what makes his sailing up the Columbia so remarkable is that the Columbia is a long river. It collects a ton of sand, a ton of silt, and a ton of runoff, and it pushes it right into the Pacific Ocean at the mouth of the river. What this creates is a bunch of shifting sandbars that make it actually very, very hard to enter into the waterway. Now, going back to this picture, you might also get the idea that, of course, a river has current. That current is pushing into the ocean current, and you get some really strange currents and some really big waves. So it's a particularly dangerous spot for a sailing ship in the 1700s. And it's often called the graveyard of the Pacific, which actually extends up north too. But this is a very common place for boats to have problems, to have shipwrecks. This is a map. This is a little farther north up by Neah Bay, but this is a map of just different wrecks in the Pacific Ocean near our borders. So the question, of course, was when he found it, it ignited again. More sailors came here because they were hoping when he found the Columbia River that what he had found was a Northwest Passage. There was a theory that these giant lakes, the Great Lakes, had to drain somewhere, and they were thinking that they probably drained in the Pacific Ocean. And if you found that Northwest Passage, you would be rich, unimaginably rich, because you'd be able to control who gets to travel through the continent. So was it a Northwest Passage? Well, no. There is no Northwest Passage except if you go around Canada up into the Arctic Ocean and you're willing to brave icebergs and cold ocean water, you can go all the way around Alaska. But there's really not a Northwest Passage. So a couple other things about the Columbia River is, well, he named it. Robert Gray named the Columbia River after his boat, which was called the Columbia. So the Columbia River is named after Robert Gray's boat from when he discovered it. There's also a few features of his name still in Washington. Columbia is down here in the south of Washington. Well, at one point he went up the coast and he found this harbor, which is now named Gray's Harbor. It's where the city of Aberdeen is, Hoquiam, and it's also the name of the county where Gray's Harbor is. So if you guys have ever been to like Elma, Washington, or Montesano, or Aberdeen, you've been to Gray's Harbor, and there's a physical Gray's Harbor as well. All that bear Robert Gray's names. So the second big impact was he helped ignite the fur trade. And really, it was focused on sea otters and beavers. Sea otters in particular made very, very warm, fashionable coats for both Europeans and Americans, but they were exceptionally popular in Europe. The sea otter has the thickest, densest fur of any animal on our planet, which makes it an exceptionally warm coat. And these became all the rage in Europe. You could make a lot of money if you could get a lot of pelts and you could bring them back to New York to be sold to Europeans. And then, of course, beaver. All three of these hats that you're looking at have beaver fur. This was kind of the outdoorsman look, and then the top hat was more of an upscale look. It's hard to know with the fur trade how many beavers were killed in the early 1800s, but at some estimates that 16,000, otters were killed. 16,000 otters were perhaps the population of otters starting in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And the Southern Ocean sea otter in California, their population got down to about 50 in 1900. So you can estimate that anywhere from 10 to 20,000 otters were pretty quickly killed in about a 50-year span and almost made extinct. It also, the fur trade, often it was Native Americans who would do the hunting. They had long hunted otter, but never to the level that Europeans did. But it did lead to some early trading between European sailors and Native American tribes, like the Chinook along the Columbia and farther up north into Alaska. But the otter trade, it was horrendous, took a horrendous impact on the otter population. And if that doesn't make you sad, here's a picture of a baby otter and a baby otter with its mom. All right, and the third big impact, if you haven't gotten it by now, it's a pretty big deal that he is American. So yeah, Robert Gray is America. It's good for patriotism. It's also good for our claim on the Pacific Northwest that we had a sailor who was able to make it here, who was able to name one of the big geographical features in the Columbia River. And it is a pretty big deal that in 1790, an American sailor is able to make it to what is now Washington State. So just to recap, the Robert Gray expedition had 3 big impacts that I'd like you to know. First, he found the Columbia River. And again, if you're thinking it might be a Northwest Passage, it's not. It actually stays primarily in Washington State with its headwaters in the British Columbia. Second, his trip, he brought back otter and beaver pelts, but he traded with the local Chinook Indians and was able to get otter pelts. He brought back otter pelts, and that helped ignite the fur trade industry in the Americas, and specifically in Europe. And lastly, he's the first American to visit Washington. And I'll leave you with this. I hope you guys enjoyed both my video and doing your assignment this way. I'll see you at the Google Meet. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks for watching, 7th graders.